Thank you for tuning in to Roll Havoc. My name is Jack Steelman. With me today, he has more initiative in one round than I had my entire college career. Please welcome Josh Plotkin.
It's called Drive, Jack.
Here to explain the difference between lawful good and lawful stupid, it's my friend Ben Grunzel.
It's what my thesis in college was on.
God damn it.
Again, Drive, very important.
So the other day I got a message from a friend of mine, Mitchell, and he's new to D&D, or relatively new to D&D, or new to DMing, and he actually wants to homebrew a campaign. And it kind of got me thinking about the homebrew experiences that I've had in the past. And I think between the three of us, we've had a decent amount of experience. We play a lot of core settings, but we introduce a lot of homebrew aspects into the games. But I think it'd be fair to say that we all have experience creating our own campaign settings and creating our own rule sets and creating our own atmosphere for a game. So I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit today and see how you guys feel about that. We haven't really touched on homebrew too much. We've talked a lot about core settings, but we haven't really talked too much about homebrew.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Eberron and Faerun, Mass Effect, and
Ravenloft.
The thing being that like Mass Effect is technically a homebrew setting that somebody else made.
I think homebrew to me is your friends get together and you make something that is nowhere else, right?
Yeah. I mean, and homebrew can be kind of broad and a lot of people have different definitions, but you're talking about like basically creating a setting from scratch and doing the campaign arc basically mostly from scratch and not from an established setting or an adventure path or something like that.
That's the first step, of course. That clarification that we just did. That's what homebrew is.
In which case I've never completely done a homebrew anything because I always steal, but that's like one of my tips. So we'll get there.
Yeah. Do you guys have a process? I know like when I think about homebrew, I kind of think like, oh, it's free range. There's like, you can do anything you want with a homebrew setting. Like if there's something that you want to do that isn't established in a core setting, that you can absolutely just take the rules and make them however you want. I think that's the coolest thing about homebrew. That's what I really like about the homebrew campaigns that I have played in. They've always just been something completely different than anything that I've played as far as the core established settings. So you can get some wild and crazy stuff with a universe that's, not out there. It really helps pull out a player or a DM's imagination, right?
And it probably also really frustrates very practiced players who have a lot of experience in what the setting is supposed to be. We've all dealt with those people that like really just know the game backwards and forwards, and then they want to like everyone to know that.
Rules lawyers.
Yeah, rules lawyers. So this is a way to basically take a rules lawyer.
Oh man.
And put him on the same field as everybody else.
I'd be really hesitant to play or to like mention my Faerun game to someone who's really dug into Forgotten Realms lore because I don't really know a ton about Forgotten Realms lore. And I really just said like, I want to play a Monster Hunter game, and Forgotten Realms it's easy. It's there. So let's just screw with it and throw giant aberrant monsters everywhere.
That is
in general, I think that's how it should be. Like you should make it your own and just use it as a stepping point.
A template, right?
I've seen some people talk about their weird Eberron games, and I'm like, that's different from what I would do. But then again,
you're like, oh, that's a choice, I guess.
Right. But with any like canon setting, there's always, I feel like fans always kind of fixate on certain things that are important to them, and then they think this is what the setting is about, this is one of the core pillars of the setting, and it's like, no, that's just one little random bit that appeals to you. That's like another whole can of worms of playing with established settings, is kind of getting on the same page of even what you want to do within the setting. But yeah, with homebrew it's wide open,
which can be daunting, right? Which is why you asked where you start with, right? So I think it's kind of important that is like, are you building it for yourself and then you'll find the players to do it, or are you building it for players that you already have?
Right. You have an established group.
So it's kind of about expectation. Like I think the first step is always, that conversation zero where you set expectations with everybody. And then you can just, just basically destroy all those expectations if you want to, which is like what a proper DM does, but make it satisfying at the same time.
There's also another thing where it could be like, okay, is it a matter of you've played every core setting that you want to and you're looking for something different, or did you read a really cool book and you're just like, man, I'd really like to throw some players into Westeros, which don't do that. That's mean.
Because there's not a lot of magic.
That's a session 0 discussion. Do you want to do grimdark, high lethality, politics and stuff like that, or everybody's superheroes? Like this. It's
you've got to pick a theme, right?
Choices.
You've got to pick your themes. Everyone's got to come to an agreement. And I think if you're going to be making a homebrew setting and you do already have a group in mind, or you have a group of players, maybe that's the time to like draft them, right?
Yeah, and personally, I think it's the DM is going to be the one spending the most time on it. So I think it's totally valid for the DM a little bit more say, because they're building the world and everything, right? And you want it to be something that's interesting for you as a DM, so that you keep coming back to it. If everybody else wants to play something you don't want to run, you're not going to want to run it, and then that's a whole other discussion. But sometimes I'll have like a couple different ideas and pitch them all. Like, hey, do you guys want to run spooky Transylvania game, or aquatic themed game, or whatever, or Theros, which is what we ended up doing.
Theros was so great. But it's important to come to terms with what themes you want to do. Like, do you want to run a horror game? Do you want to run like high fantasy? Do you want to run a steampunk game? Like, there are a ton of different ways. The coolest thing about tabletop RPGs is that usually you can interpret the rules for a lot of different scenarios. So if you really want to, you can say, well, these rules work really well for a horror setting. These rules, maybe not so much. So when you're coming to terms with a homebrew setting, you kind of have to have that planning session where you're like, all right, what do I want to fit into this campaign? And what am I going to kind of like steer the group away from? I think one thing that we do is we don't go towards the normal fantasy tropes of like, well, we want to make sure we have a tank. We want to make sure we have a wizard and a cleric and stuff like that. It's like, no, like, we're not going to pigeonhole the choices. But sometimes for a game, you might want to say like, all right, no humans. Sometimes the setting might be like, okay, well, this particular campaign that we're running in, for whatever reason, you can only play humans.
I think kind of what you're hitting on is that limiting any aspect of the basic set of rules kind of is the key structure, the pillars of what a homebrew setting really is, because I can't think of a single structured D&D setting, an existing one, that doesn't kind of integrate everything that like every book has been able to provide, and you're basically saying, I'm going to cut this book out. I'm going to cut this out. Is like, because maybe you have plans for that later, but you just don't want the players to be thinking about that when they're moving through this world for you. It's like, perhaps you're like, this is a very low magic setting, because you want your players, you'll eventually make them high magic to face the high magic threats that nobody else can handle, right? And whereas, if you go into Faerun, like, well, why do you guys even exist? There's things here already to take care of everything, right? So some of it has to do with what type of satisfaction you plan on giving to your players through the story, and then what you're going to get out of it too as the DM, because it has to be entertaining for you.
That's an important distinction too, where we're talking about specifically here. I'm talking about like, I'm talking about homebrew setting, homebrew campaign, homebrew storytelling. When it comes to like making homebrew classes, making homebrew abilities, homebrew spells, weapons, that's a whole other conversation. It's like, because when you get to even third party content that is published and established, that isn't from whatever the original publisher is. If it's D&D, it's Wizards of the Coast, or if it's Paizo and Pathfinder, it's like you've got to have some kind of leveling of balance to make sure that this third party or homebrew class or ability or feat isn't just going to completely overpower the rest of the game. So that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, when it comes to a homebrew campaign setting, this is where you're probably going to want to say like, all right, so in this world, the elves are feral and they're not a playable race, and then the like lizard folk might take the role of like nature's protectors or something like that. I think rules like that are kind of cool.
Yeah, and so like making choices about like limiting options or going off of the standard like fantasy tropes, those can really help define a homebrew setting. I think it's if you have a really cool concept, that's a great way to make the campaign seem different than just your standard. And the thing is, yeah, you just want to touch base and make sure your players are okay with that, because as important it is as a DM to be able to be interested in your campaign and have a really, you think you have a really cool idea you've put a lot of work into, and to bring that forward and you're going to be running the game. If nobody wants to play it, you have to figure out, the play styles and expectations of your players and take that into account too. It's always going to be a balance.
I remember when we started playing that medieval knight game that Ben set up, that whole concept was just, all right, think of like low magic, feudal setting where it's like you're all going to be playing like disgraced knights. So come up with a character concept, and that was essentially like a homebrew. We weren't playing in like, oh, these are like knights in Eberron or knights in Forgotten Realms or, whatever. No, we're just going to do like, you could be in the middle of like a mud hole in England, and and that's a concept. And so from there, we started talking about like, all right, what are the player options? And you're just like, you mainly want to play humans, but if you want to play something else, we can justify it. But it's going to have more of a fairy tale type feeling. So I was like, okay, what if I wanted my squire to be like a half elf? You're like, oh, well, then they would be that. What was exactly you said for the half elves in that game?
I decided that half elves were humans that had been taken away as babies, replaced with a changeling, and raised in Elfland.
Yeah.
So that they had some elven characteristics, but some human. And so they weren't the child of a human and an elf. It was just, they were like raised among fairy creatures. So
which is a great example of taking existing rules and flavoring it to fit the homebrew setting.
Yeah. And I've done that like as long as I can remember wanting to run D&D, like the creative side of that, of like coming up with an idea and then mapping the existing classes and races to that. Like the first 3rd edition campaign I ever ran was a Stone Age game, and I was like, okay, there, some of the races didn't make sense.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I came up with like some custom equipment lists, like how like wood and stone and obsidian weapons were different from each other, and like the only written language was Draconic because that's where magic came from. They were fighting like lizard folk and rakshasas because it's like, okay, like animal-headed demons and lizard folk. They even like a lizard folk vampire at one point, like, and it was a lot of fun. It was very like
nice
pointed, towards a certain feel, but it worked. Yeah.
Now, when you built that in the first place, you had the idea for Stone Age, but then you had to work with your players, right, to kind of flesh out little bits and pieces of it.
Yeah, and again, because this was like the first time any of us had played a 3rd edition campaign, so they were pretty game for it. They still had lots of options to choose from, so everybody seemed okay with that. That's going to vary. Sometimes people are really set on like having a certain idea of a certain race or class they want to play, a certain build they want to try out, and even if you don't think it perfectly fits your campaign setting, the thing is the players are also supposed to be heroes and exceptional and different. So, say you want to run like a game that's like post-apocalyptic, all the humans have died, and you want everybody to play like monster races or something, but somebody really wanted to play a human paladin, make him like the last human paladin. Maybe he's like been stuck in a tomb and just got reawakened by the last spark of his god or something like that, and is trying to reignite it or something. Like, you can come up with a story,
I think Ben just accidentally made Link from Breath of the Wild.
Oh, damn it. Now I want to play that character, Dave.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you got the itch now.
Yeah,
turn it off.
Well, I'd be surprised if after this conversation, the 3 of us don't want to just like go make a new homebrew game.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always up for playing, but like, I think the only homebrew that I just did from scratch, it was fun, but what I recall the problems being for me was that like I had these set ideas, and it's like, and I, instead of allowing my players to go off the rails, I instead basically built it so that it would be very, very hard for them to do so with what was happening to them. They, like they could, of course, chose a different action, but the thing is, I felt like there was friction when that type of thing happens. And I think that can happen in a homebrew setting because you have to, as the DM, have creative knowledge of everything that you've built, right? And the players don't have any, so they don't have the understanding about why they can't do something, right? Whereas if you are using a set campaign setting, you're like, you can't do it because it says right here, this is already done. There's nothing over there for you to go to, or, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot about needing to be super flexible when you make a homebrew setting that doesn't necessarily come with standard running D&D.
Right. A lot of DMs want to say, no, this is my vision. This is how this game is going to go. And you're going to do it, or you're going to get away from my table.
Yeah.
Which is not a fun way to play D&D. Not a fun way to play D&D. One thing,
it's a good way to not have any players.
It's a good way to not have any players. It's one of my favorite things about the way that Ben DMs. He says, he's like, I made a world for the characters to explore. And I can't tell you how many times we've probably like completely gone around Ben's plans and he's had to wing stuff. And that's true of every setting, whether you're playing a homebrew or whether you're playing a core setting, or whether you're playing something established or whatever. It's like, no, you can't predict what the players are going to do. You have to be able to roll with it.
Seat of the pants is Ben's DM style, though, right? And not everybody is gifted with that ability to be that flexible, or the fact that we throw a curveball and he's like, sweet curveball. I like that curveball. Yeah. That's the curveball we're going to go with right now. Let me make how that curveball works.
I think if that's not your style, though, then you as a DM need to be ultra prepared and have half a dozen scenarios planned out. And then whenever the players throw you a curveball, you say, well, this scenario kind of fits that. So let's wiggle that into place. And maybe that's what you have to do if that's your DM style. As you're making this homebrew setting, you have to kind of come up with some wild off the cuff stuff that you can kind of just slide in. And honestly, a lot of that might come down to just having some extra details that you think might not ever come up, and then whenever somebody asks a random question, you find a way to slip it in.
Yeah. So say if you have like you have like your campaign concept and your players are on board and you're trying to plan out what to do in the campaign, I think there's a term of building situations, not plots, because it's hard to build a plot because you're not in control of all the main characters. As a DM, they might do something unexpected, and there's some players that are okay with just kind of like being on a railroad and going through a story that's already pre-plotted. But I personally, I don't get that. Personally, I want to have my character interact with things and try to change things around them the way that their character would, not based on a predetermined story. But the way to avoid, because it's easy to think, okay, this is the story of my campaign and the players are going to run through it. But it's better to think of like, here's the initial setup. When the curtain goes up, what's happening in the world and what just happened that made things change and now the players are reacting to. It's okay to think, okay, well, the villain wants to take over the world by unleashing the Dragon Queen or something like that. But you just have to know his plan. The players are supposed to interrupt that plan. That's what they're there to do. So when that happens, what's he going to do to think around that? He's a smart person. They are a smart person. DM, as you know the world, they should have contingency plans. They should have other lieutenants that would rise up if your big bad guy suddenly gets ganked by a critical hit at 3rd level.
Has that ever happened to you, Ben? Who hurt you?
Yeah, that's definitely happened. Like longbows have a ridiculous range. It's faster than than the horse can get away. But I mean, that's D&D. Like trying to like, oh no, he's immune to arrows. Like that's
that wasn't the actual big bad guy.
But that's a good way to handle it, is that there should be like a coalition of bad guys so that if somebody falls, somebody else can rise up.
Because I'm that player who will chase down that bad guy. It's like he's just on a horse. There's faster things than a horse. We just got to figure that out.
Yeah.
Like my arrow, says the elf.
Yeah. And as a DM, maybe you just forgot, like, oh yeah, man, I shouldn't have let him get that close. That was silly.
As a DM, you're like, man, I forgot the elf had a bow.
Yeah. It happens.
I forgot.
Yeah.
I forgot that Legolas has a bow. It's all he's been using for the past 4 adventures. But I just fucking
Well,
forgot.
you plan stuff in your head and you kind of like envision how it's going to play out, and before the players create their characters, and you weren't thinking about having a ranger in the party with a 400-foot reach on their bow, and then it comes up and it's like, oh, you don't want to nerf it. You got to roll with it and have the world react to what the players do.
Oh man, you add 50 hit points to the bad guy, you make the arrow hit them still, and then next time you see him, they got a sweet scar. Yeah.
Maybe it could even like you hit him in the eye.
Yeah.
Guess what? Next time you see him, he's like, he should be dead, but the body disappeared. Yeah. The next time you see him, he's got an eye patch.
One eye, and he's got a magic eye.
There you go.
Yeah, that lets him shoot lasers.
Or he just shows up again, resurrected, because there's a lich above him telling him what to do, and he just brought the guy back and said, you fail me again.
Or you do what I do in that Middle Earth game, and he just comes back and you don't know what the fuck happened.
That too.
Or I realized we could do ors continually for the rest of this episode forever. Because we're really knowledgeable about this. But what I was thinking, I just realized this, what allows a homebrew setting to flow easily and probably avoid some of those issues where maybe you didn't have everything planned, is if you lean heavy into the role play aspect of it rather than the rules, the mechanical rules aspect of it, because then maybe you don't have to roll up or find the stats for these new monsters. Maybe the majority of this session is discourse between them and NPCs, right? And that lets you as the DM just kind of be creative and wing it a little bit better, right? And maybe you can even kind of influence a little bit more where you want the players to go.
I could see that. I think as for that to work, you'd have to make sure that the group is okay with explaining things through RP. Not every group likes to lean into role playing, or at least not everybody in every group likes to lean into the RP. And so I think that might come down to like, that might be a matter of, okay, well, you can do that, but that's a matter of like, do you tailor this particular storytelling style to the group or not? Maybe that's something that you do to put this group out of their comfort zone. This is a whole new type of setting that maybe you haven't played with before, and you're like, okay, I'm going to put you out of your comfort zone. We're going to RP and figure out some of these story details together, and you have to trust that I as the DM have enough in my sleeves to keep the story moving for you if we kind of get stuck. But yeah, no, that could totally work where you lean more into the RP side instead of trying to, pull specific rules from how many different rule books are there? Like thousands.
Can't even.
Like instead of trying to like say, all right, this book is on, this book is off, this half of this book is on, this half of this book is off. Maybe it's not that simple. No, I like that.
Yeah. And role playing doesn't always have to be like social encounters. That's what people think of. But I mean, role playing just means, what would my character do? And that could be, let's go search the abandoned castle and look for clues or something like that. It could be an exploration thing that is character driven. And that's really, you just want it to be character driven. You also just want it to make sense with your world. I think one good tip for improving too is try to come up with like 2 or 3 pillars of like what makes this world the way it is. Like I remember seeing this advice in some really old Dragon magazine where somebody said like they played with somebody who was a sci-fi game and they could always just improv anything no matter what happened. It's like, how did you do this? He's like, well, I just have 2 basic conceits of the world. There's a huge empire that controls all of space, and it's just backed up with bureaucracy and red tape, and nobody cares about their job. And that lets you do so much. They're like, okay, we duck into through a random door in a hallway in a spaceship. What do we see? And it's like, it's the janitor's closet, but it's a mess. Nobody's cleaned up in here in a while. There's overstocked on this and understocked on this. And like, because this makes sense. Like it's an ordered world where people don't do their job properly. And that lets you riff on all kinds of random situations. And you could do that with a fantasy campaign. If you want to do like, okay, this is like Middle Earth, but Sauron won, that gives you like a basis to go with of like, you can't rely on the regular institutions of humans that you think of, and there's evil everywhere on the, you got to be on the watch out for. So that lets you improvise. Okay, we go to town to buy supplies. Well, you can extrapolate what might happen in town just from those two pillars you established for the world.
Right. Yeah. So it's like you enter a situation there where it's like, okay, the people of this scenario, the people of a setting like that are already very distrustful, but now they're downright hostile, probably to strangers and outsiders. That's a really cool aspect that you can kind of pull into that.
Yeah.
So it's a, it's a very flexible structure is what you're kind of saying.
But to our point though, that means you still have to be really good at winging it.
Yeah.
You still have to be really good at winging it.
But I mean, that's like a tool you can use to make it easier for improv.
Yeah. But I also feel like if you as a DM are going to homebrew a setting, homebrew a game or anything like that, unless you're a novelist, unless you're a person who like can punch out 1,000 words of content a day and make a setting that has a whole bunch of details kind of already fleshed out, unless you're already like at that level of storytelling, you're going to be winging a lot of this. And even if I know people who have created campaign settings based off of stories, short stories, novellas, novels, whatever. I know people who have created campaign settings based off of stories that they have made, and they still, DMing, you can't guess what your players are going to do every time. You're gonna have to wing it sometimes. And so I think that's kind of the natural progression of DMing is you probably get like an adventure module, right? At some point, you learn how to follow the adventure module and you learn how tabletop RPG stories are supposed to go. And then at some point you get really interested in a campaign setting. And so you start writing your own adventures in a campaign setting. And that helps you learn how to wing an established story. And that helps you kind of learn how to roll with whatever your players are going to throw at you. And then at that point, you might be thinking, okay, now is a good time for me to say, I have this idea, or I read this book, or I have this thing that's just kind of always been there that I've wanted to try. And then you say, all right, well, I'm ready to take it to the next step and create my own setting with its own rules and its own kind of universe, right?
Well, you said maybe you read a book, maybe you saw a movie, maybe something. So what it is that something piqued the DM's interest enough to want to create something new and different, right? So I think that's kind of like that initiative is what is what you need to really, like, I think make a homebrew setting work, right? You as a DM have to care about it enough to do all this extra work, to want to improv when a situation comes up rather than being able to go to a book. So that passion kind of matters a lot. And I do have an example. I remember after the first Constantine movie came out with Keanu Reeves, that was in college, and I had a friend who took the D20 modern rules and then made a Constantine-esque universe where we're fighting demons that are inhabiting human bodies. There's angels that don't do anything besides observe or potentially try to hurt you if you're doing something wrong.
They don't do anything but say like, stop doing that. You're not supposed to do that. It's like with the bad guys, but fuck off. players,
we had to like figure out classes that could somehow also not look like just crazy murderers in this modern world, right? Like, it's like, oh, why do you have a giant sledgehammer? It's like, well, I'm a construction worker. It's just like, it's in my truck. I keep it with me. It's like, so can't use guns, right? Because you have to try. So it's all these things that they were able to kind of change D20 modern simply because they saw something that was interesting enough and it gave enough rules and inspiration that they could wing it from there. We as players didn't think about that the first time we were playing. We're like, oh, we have a shotgun or we have pistols, right? And we use it. And it's like, oh, the cops were on us after that first demon that we killed, but it turns back into a human, right? We didn't know about that, but the DM did, right? But as players should have probably, because we're humans sitting in this world. It was very fun, but if it wasn't for the DM caring about what we were doing, it wouldn't have been much more than just D20 Modern.
I think with a situation like that, it's really, honestly, I would have loved to play that game.
It was fun. It was really fun.
That sounds really fucking cool. But I think with most homebrew, I think my experiences with homebrew, there's always been still some like link to the D20 canon. So it's like in third edition, our homebrew planet was actually still connected to the rest of the planes, right? And so there's always that potential where it's like, if you make this homebrew game and you bring in enough, you can still connect it to a whole bunch of really cool established content too. So that's where it's like Ravenloft is a freaking great example, because there's always a way to drag people into Ravenloft, even from a homebrew setting. It's really easy to do from a homebrew setting. So it's like, I think that's one of the coolest things about homebrew, is that you don't necessarily even need to like feel like you're going to miss out on all of the other cool stuff that other settings or other rule books have to offer, just because you want to play this one particular flavor. You can find ways to fit a whole bunch of stuff in if you just source from your players, what do they want to do, and then figure out a way to make it work. There's plenty of resources out there to make anything work.
And if they're experienced players, like you taking this homebrew setting and just reconnecting back to something they know, it's like the same level as another superhero in this Marvel movie cameo, right? People are like, there it is, and I'm sure it would make them very excited too. And so that's kind of funny way of thinking about it, right? You're able to make this homebrew setting, but you're able to still kind of rely on what's already been built in order to enhance it. I like that a lot. Tell your friend that. Write that down.
Yeah, it's okay to steal from other stuff and put it in your homebrew. It doesn't have to be 100% original. I mean, nobody's like policing your game. You're not publishing it anywhere. It's okay to like cobble stuff together.
And hell, if it's good enough, publish it somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, definitely, like, that's perfectly fine.
I feel like that's one thing, because sometimes I've had people say like, oh, that was a really cool adventure, you should write that up and publish it. And I'm like, that is totally just two different things that already exist smashed together. Like, it would be unethical to. I just think of what would be cool for a game. I mean, I remember one time I ran a like a haunted mansion that was just a whole bunch of references from Hellboy comics, like 4 or 5 different Hellboy encounters all smashed into one location.
Can I play that? Can we play that?
Can we play? I want to play.
You have played that, Josh.
I know.
It's been a while.
It's been a long time, but I remember it was pretty fun. Yeah. I mean, so like that's homebrew, right? It didn't feel necessarily like homebrew,
right? You can change a couple little things, and
I think when you're doing it right, it doesn't feel like it's something that's not supported by a lot of content, right?
Yeah, and most of the time, players aren't going to care if something is derivative. They're going to be like, "Oh, cool! This is just like the thing that is obviously stolen from."
Yeah. We did a homebrew campaign setting that was literally just like, it was a nexus of video game characters, and so you got to play using 3rd edition rules. You got to play with a whole bunch of different weapons from Mega Man, weapons from Castlevania. Final Fantasy VII had just came out, so we were just like, fuck yeah, I want like a giant ass buster sword, that taking ideas like that and just doing absolutely crazy stuff while still involving pop culture or still involving other things that you find in tabletop RPGs is perfectly acceptable. It's like, if it's the rule of cool. If it's cool, let it happen,
Yeah. If everybody's ripping off different things and smashing it together, it's going to feel original. Like, yeah, it's a Castlevania rip-off setting, but has Castlevania ever had Legolas and Conan go through it? Nope.
Probably wouldn't be around that much.
Actually, yeah, they have in Castlevania Bloodlines.
I think what we're trying to get around here is, take it seriously, but don't have fun.
Anticipate that you're going to have to wing a lot of it unless you've spent a lot of time writing up a whole bunch of backstory and or scenario.
And just make sure that your players are prepared for all of that. Make sure they're on the same page that you are. And I think everything will work out just fine.
I think one thing, sometimes I see advice of like, start small, like just build like a village and a couple like adventure things around the village, and that's fine. Actually, that's pretty good advice for like to start off a campaign. But at the same time, if you have like this idea of like the continents have sank and everybody lives on the back of giant dragons in the ocean, that's awesome. Go with that. If that's an idea that excites you, it's okay to think big concept. It's okay to flesh out your world. Just don't expect the players to care. Players sometimes are just like, all right, how can I get 200 gold out of this? Like,
they're like, sometimes the players are like, wow, everybody lives on the backs of dragons. That's cool. Hey, let's hyperfixate on this one tree for 3 hours.
Yeah.
You described this tree so well. There's got to be something weird about it. Let's look at this tree.
Yeah, that's just Tolkien.
That's just Tolkien. Sorry, that's just me. I'm sorry.
But a lot of world building is just for yourself, and that's fine because it'll inform the stuff you put in the adventure that the players do care about. But sometimes I see DMs who have this whole expansive backstory for their campaign that the players don't know anything about because they've never dug into it.
As a piece of writing advice I saw once was like, keep in mind that other stuff happens around the story. Even if it never comes up, there is other stuff happening. So it could be like little details that you get to throw in at some point that might be happening in the next kingdom, the next country, the next star system, whatever, could still impact what's going on in the story. And that way, if the players do start to stray, you have something that's kind of set up at the perimeter already, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's really good advice too. It's just make it seem like a real world with other stuff going on. It may come up. Even if it doesn't, it makes the world seem alive.
I'm so glad we got to sit down and talk about homebrew campaigns today. They are some of the most crazy adventures you can have, is when you have a DM who just goes, hey, I want to try something, just roll with this. But for now, thank you for listening to Roll Havoc. My name is Jack Steelman, here to remind you that werewolves aren't necessarily the problem. It's the overhear wolves that you really have to worry about. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Roll Havoc.